to the session on agriculture and its types. First, let us understand a brief introduction of the topic. Over the history of human settlements on the planet Earth, agriculture has transformed in tune with the growing population and its challenging needs. The transformation has been quite remarkable since the end of World War II. Food and fiber productivity sped up due to adoption of new technologies such as high-yielding varieties from mechanization, increased fertilizer and pesticide use, specialized farming practices, water resource development and improved irrigation practices, and also government policies that favored maximizing production. It was in the early 1960s that the Green Revolution took shape in the developing countries, especially in India. It led to the attainment of self-sufficiency in food grain production. This has been described by Donald Plunkett in 1993, then scientific advisor to the CGIAR, as the greatest agricultural transformation in the history of humankind, and most of it has taken place during our lifetime. The change was brought about by the rise of science-based agriculture, which permitted higher and more stable food production, ensuring food stability and security for a constantly growing world population. Agriculture, also known as farming or husbandry, is the cultivation of animals, plants, fungi, and other life forms for food, fiber, biofuel, drugs, and other products used to sustain and enhance human life. Agriculture was the key development in the rise of sedentary human civilization, whereby farming of domesticated species created food surpluses that nurtured the development of civilization. The study of agriculture is known as agricultural science. The history of agriculture dates back thousands of years, and its development has been driven and defined by greatly different climates, cultures, and technologies. However, all farming generally relies on techniques to expand and maintain the lands that are suitable for raising domesticated species. For plants, this usually requires some form of irrigation, although there are methods of dryland farming. Livestock are raised in a combination of grassland-based and landless systems in an industry that covers almost 1/3 of the world's ice and water-free area. In the developed world, industrial agriculture based on large-scale monoculture has become the dominant system of modern farming, although there is growing support for sustainable agriculture, including permaculture and organic agriculture. Until the Industrial Revolution, the vast majority of the human population labored in agriculture. Pre-industrial agriculture was typically subsistence agriculture or self-sufficiency, in which farmers raised most of their crops for their own consumption instead of cash crops for trade. A remarkable shift in agricultural practices has occurred over the past century in response to new technologies and the development of world markets. This also has led to technological improvements in agricultural techniques such as the Haber-Bosch method for synthesizing ammonium nitrate, which made the traditional practice of recycling nutrients with crop rotation and animal manure less important. The major agricultural products can be broadly grouped into foods, fibers, fuels, and raw materials. Specific foods include cereals, that is grains, vegetables, fruits, oils, meats, and spices. Fibers include cotton, wool, hemp, silk, and flax. Raw materials include lumber and bamboo. Over 1/3 of the world's workers are employed in agriculture, second only to the services sector, although the percentages of agricultural workers in developed countries has decreased significantly over the past several centuries. Now next, moving on to the different types of agriculture. India has diversified topography. The country has Himalayan mountain ranges extending from Jammu and Kashmir in the west to Arunachal Pradesh in the northeast. Central part of India is dominated by plateau area. Apart from variation in landform, the country has varieties of climatic conditions and soil types. These physical variations, along with other factors like availability of irrigation, use of machinery, modern agricultural inputs like high yielding varieties, that is HYV, of seeds, insecticides and pesticides, have played their respective roles in the evolution of different farming practices in India. Some of the major types of farming have been discussed here. The first is subsistence agriculture. Subsistence agriculture is self-sufficiency farming in which the farmers focus on growing enough food to feed themselves and their families. The typical subsistence farm has a range of crops and animals needed by the family to feed and clothe themselves during the year. Planting decisions are made principally with an eye towards what the family will need during the coming year and secondarily toward market prices. Tony Waters writes, "Subsistence peasants are people who grow what they eat, build their own houses and live without regularly making purchases in the marketplace." However, despite the primacy of self-sufficiency in subsistence farming, today most subsistence farmers also participate in trade to some degree, though usually it is for goods that are not necessary for survival and may include sugar, iron roofing sheets, bicycles, used clothing and so forth. Most subsistence farmers today live in developing countries. Although their amount of trade as measured in cash is less than that of consumers in countries with modern complex markets, many have important trade contacts and trade items that they can produce because of their special skills or special access to resources valued in the marketplace. Majority of farmers in India practice subsistence farming. This means farming for own consumption. In other words, the entire production is largely consumed by the farmers and their family, and they do not have any surplus to sell in the market. In this type of farming, land holdings are small and fragmented. Cultivation techniques are primitive and simple. In other words, there is a total absence of modern equipments like tractors and farm inputs like chemical fertilizers, insecticides and pesticides. In this farming, farmers mostly cultivate cereals along with oil seeds, pulses, vegetables and sugarcane. Now the second type of agriculture is called as commercial agriculture. Commercial agriculture is just the opposite to subsistence farming. In this case, most of the produce is sold in the market for earning money. In this system, farmers use inputs like irrigation, chemical fertilizers, insecticides, pesticides and high-yielding varieties of seeds, etc. Some of the major commercial crops grown in different parts of India are cotton, jute, sugarcane, groundnut, etc. Rice farming in Haryana is mainly for commercial purpose as people of this area are predominantly wheat eaters. However, in east and northeastern states of India, rice cultivation would be largely of subsistence type. Now the third type of agriculture is intensive agriculture. Intensive farming aims at maximum possible production on the limited farms with all efforts possible under the circumstances. Intensive farming is capable of raising more than one crop a year. Huge capital and human labor is employed on every hectare of land. It is practiced in most parts of densely populated areas. Intensive farming or intensive agriculture is an agricultural production system characterized by a low fallow ratio and the high use of inputs such as capital, labor, or heavy use of pesticides and chemical fertilizers relative to the land area. This is in contrast to many sorts of traditional agriculture in which the inputs per unit land are lower. With intensification, energy use typically goes up, initially provided by humans, then supplemented with animals and supplemented or replaced with machines. Intensive animal farming practices can involve very large numbers of animals raised on limited land, which requires large amounts of food, water and medical inputs, which are required to keep the animals healthy in cramped conditions. Very large or confined indoor intensive livestock operations are often referred to as factory farming and are criticized by opponents for the low level of animal welfare standards and associated pollution and health issues. The fourth type of agriculture is extensive farming. It is the modern system of farming done on large farms. It is also known as mechanical farming due to extensive use of machines. Extensive farm raises only one crop a year. Employment of labor and capital per hectare of land is comparatively less. It is practiced in sparsely populated areas like USA, Canada, Russia and Australia. As opposed to intensive farming, in case of extensive agriculture, it uses small inputs of labor, fertilizers and capital relative to the land area being farmed. Extensive farming most commonly refers to sheep and cattle farming in areas with low agricultural productivity, but can also refer to large-scale growing of wheat, barley and other grain crops in areas like the Murray-Darling Basin. Here, owing to the extreme age and poverty of the soils, yields per hectare are very low, but the flat terrain and very large farm sizes mean yields per unit of labor are high. Nomadic herding is an extreme example of extensive farming, where herders move their animals to use feed from occasional rainfalls. The fifth type of agriculture is plantation agriculture. Here it is an estate where a single cash crop is grown for sale. This type of agriculture involves growing and processing of a single cash crop purely meant for sale. Tea, coffee, rubber, banana and spices are all examples of plantation crops. Most of these crops were introduced in India by the Britishers in the 19th century. A plantation can be referred to as a long artificially established forest, farm or an estate where crops are grown for sale, often in distant markets rather than for local on-site consumption. The term plantation is informal and not precisely defined. Plantations are grown on a large scale as the crops are grown for commercial purposes and not for local consumption. Crops grown on plantations include fast-growing trees, often conifers, cotton, coffee, tobacco, sugarcane, sisal, some oil seeds such as oil palms and rubber trees. Farms that produce alfalfa, lespedeza, clover and other forage crops are usually not called as plantations. The term plantation has usually not included large orchards except for banana plantations, but does include the planting of trees for lumber. A plantation is always a monoculture over a large area and does not include extensive, naturally occurring stands of plants that have economic value. Because of its large size, a plantation takes advantage of economies of scale. Protectionist policies and natural comparative advantage have contributed to determining where plantations have been located. Among the earliest examples of plantations were the latifundia of the Roman Empire, which produced large quantities of wine and olive oil for export. Plantation agriculture grew rapidly with the increase in international trade and the development of a worldwide economy that followed the expansion of European colonial empires. Like every economic activity, it has changed over time. The sixth type of farming is called as mixed farming. It is a situation in which both the raising crops and rearing animals are carried on simultaneously. Here, farmers engaged in mixed farming are economically better off than others. It is the dominant system in Europe, where most farms have a mixture of fields and pastures. For example, the same farm may grow cereal crops and keep cattle, sheep, pigs, or poultry. Mixed farming can also involve growing two or more diverse crops on the same piece of land. It is also referred to as intercropping or co-cultivation. It helps in balancing of soil nutrients, keeping down weeds and curbing plant diseases. Some of the advantages of mixed farming are as follows. It offers highest returns on farm business as the byproducts of farm are properly utilized. Efficient utilization of land, labor, equipment and other resources can be done. The crop byproducts such as straw, bus, fodder, etc. is used for feeding of livestock and in return they provide milk. Manures available from the livestock maintain soil fertility. It also helps in supplying all the food needs of the family members. Intensive cultivation is possible here. If one source of income is lost, the farmer can maintain his family from another source of income. Milk cattle provide draft animals for crop production and rural transport. And finally, mixed farming increases the social status of the farmer. In India, the livestock is much close connected with agriculture because animal power is the main source of power in agriculture. FYM, that is farmyard manure, is the main source for maintaining soil fertility, and animals make good use of subsidiary and byproducts on farms, and in turn they provide milk. Under such circumstances, mixed farming will most suit in Indian agricultural conditions. The seventh type of agriculture is shifting agriculture. In shifting agriculture, land is obtained by clearing forest and agriculture is practiced till the fertility of the farm is exhausted. After this, another farm is cleared and agriculture is practiced on it. Usually, plant tuber crops like yam, tapioca and root crops are raised. It is practiced mainly by tribals living in the forest. Shifting agriculture is referred to as an agricultural system in which plots of land are cultivated temporarily, then abandoned and allowed to revert to their natural vegetation while the cultivator moves on to another plot. The period of cultivation is usually terminated when the soil shows signs of exhaustion or, more commonly, when the field is overrun by weeds. The length of time that a field is cultivated is usually shorter than the period over which the land is allowed to regenerate by lying fallow. Of these cultivators, many use a practice of slash and burn as one element of their farming cycle. Others employ land clearing without any burning, and some cultivators are purely migratory and do not use any cyclical method on a given plot. Sometimes no slashing at all is needed where regrowth is purely of grasses, an outcome not uncommon when soils are near exhaustion and need to lie fallow. One land clearing system of shifting agriculture is the slash and burn method, which leaves only stumps and large trees in the field after the standing vegetation has been cut down and burned, its ashes enriching the soil. Cultivation of the earth after clearing is usually accomplished by hoe or digging stick and not by plough. The eighth type of farming practice is called as dryland farming. In dryland farming, moisture is maintained by raising special types of crops. Jawar, bajra and peas are such crops which need less water. This is practiced in dry areas of the country such as western, northwestern India and central India. It is practiced in low rainfall areas or where there is inadequate irrigation facility. Dryland farming has evolved as a set of techniques and management practices used by farmers to continually adapt to the presence or lack of moisture in a given crop cycle. In marginal regions, a farmer should be financially able to survive occasional crop failures, perhaps for several years in succession. Survival as a dryland farmer requires careful husbandry of the moisture available for the crop and aggressive management of expenses to minimize losses in poor years. Dryland farming involves the constant assessing of the amount of moisture present or lacking for any given crop cycle and planning accordingly. Dryland farmers know that to financially succeed, they have to be aggressive during the good years in order to offset the bad year. Dryland farming is uniquely dependent on natural rainfall, which can leave the ground vulnerable to dust storms, particularly if poor farming techniques are used or if the storms strike at a particularly vulnerable time. The fact that a fallow period must be included in the crop rotation means that fields cannot always be protected by a cover crop, which might otherwise offer protection against erosion. The ninth type of farming practice is wetland farming. Wetland farming depends mainly upon rains, so it is practiced in high rainfall or well irrigated areas. In this type of farming, rice, jute, sugarcane are grown. This type of farming is prevalent northeastern India and on the slopes of the Western Ghats. Now next, moving on to the salient features of Indian agriculture. The first feature would be that of subsistence agriculture. As mentioned earlier, most parts of India have subsistence agriculture. This type of agriculture has been practiced in India for several hundreds of years and still prevails in a larger part of India in spite of the large-scale change in agricultural practices after independence. Secondly, the pressure of population on agriculture. Despite increase in urbanization and industrialization, about 70% of population is still directly or indirectly dependent on agriculture. The third feature is the mechanization of farming. Green Revolution took place in India in the late 60s and early 70s. After more than 40 years of Green Revolution and revolution in agricultural machinery and equipments, complete mechanization is still a distant dream. Next is the dependence upon monsoon. Since independence, there has been a rapid expansion of irrigation infrastructure. Despite the large-scale expansion, only about one-third of total cropped area is irrigated today. As a consequence, two-thirds of cropped areas is still dependent upon monsoon. As we know, monsoon in India is uncertain and unreliable. This has become even more unreliable due to the change in climate. The next feature would be that of the variety of crops. India has diversity of topography, climate and soil. Since India has both tropical and temperate climate, crops of both the climate are found in India. There are very few countries in the world that have variety comparable to that of India. Next is the predominance of food crops. Since Indian agriculture has to feed a large population, production of food crops is the first priority of the farmers almost everywhere in the country. However, in recent years, there has been a decline in the share of land used for food crops due to various other commercially available reasons and advantages of these lands. Next is the seasonal patterns. India has three distinct agricultural or cropping seasons. You might have heard about Kharif, Rabi and Zaid. In India, there are specific crops grown in these three seasons. For example, rice is a Kharif crop, whereas wheat is a Rabi crop. Now finally coming to the summary of this session. What we have learnt is that there are different types of farming practiced in India. Some of these practices are subsistence and commercial farming, intensive and extensive farming, plantation farming and mixed farming. The major salient features of Indian agriculture are subsistence agriculture, which is highly dependent on monsoon and animals, variety of crops and predominance of food crops. Major crops in India can be broadly divided into four categories, that is food crops, cash crops, plantation crops and fruits. Thank you.